Hello to my social theory class. So today we're going to talk about the Frankfort School. The Frankfort School is maybe the most important thing to happen to Marxism after Marx. And it's really an attempt to rework Marxism in the light of changes that happen in the 20th century. Particularly the rise of totalitarianism. Now by totalitarianism I mean two things. I mean the governmental structure during Nazism and other forms of fascism, as well as the rise of sort of stricter governments in the Soviet bloc. So things like Russia. Totalitarianism has a huge impact on the Frankfurt School, partially because they're living through it. So the Frankfurt School was originally founded in Frankfurt, Germany. Most of the members of the Frankfurt School are themselves Jewish intellectuals who then flee to the United States during fascism. A couple of them stay behind. One of the figures that you guys are going to read, Walter Benjamin, stayed behind and was in fact killed by the Nazis. But most of them went over to the United States, reformulated in Colombia, later moved to the West Coast and to Pacific Palisades. So yeah, the Frankfurt School essentially wants to understand how is it that we tie this sort of rise of totalitarianism to the things that we learned about capitalism from Marx. And there's a couple of examples, and mainly they do this sort of reworking of Marx by adding in elements of Max Weber, particularly this idea of rationalization, as well as some concepts from Freud. And to get us into thinking through the Frankfurt School, I'm going to give us a couple examples of how this works. One of which is going to be from the theorist Erich Fromm, who wrote a book called Escape from Freedom. And Fromm starts from the observation that, especially if you're talking about forms of fascism, fascism pretty much only happens in democracies. So things come from being a democracy to becoming possibly the most authoritarian form of government, the most controlling form of government possible. This was true in Germany, it was true in Italy, and you see it today, and I think that there's sort of like a growing relevance again of the Frankfurt School's observations on totalitarianism, because essentially we're moving towards authoritarian forms of government both in the United States and in other places in Europe. Places like Austria. And what you see is in all these cases they start out very much so as modern liberal democracies, and then they slowly give up, right? They give up their freedom, they give up their powers, they give up their rights to allow somebody to control them. And Erich Fromm is very interested in that question. And so and as the title somewhat ironically indicates, he thinks that there's something with how we think about freedom in modern Western democracies, that particularly from capitalist democracies, that lead into authoritarianism. And we have a tendency to think of freedom as one thing. That we either have freedom or that we don't have freedom, that we have the Bill of Rights that guarantees us freedoms. But freedom can be experienced, according to Fromm, is either positive freedoms or negative freedoms. Positive freedoms are essentially the freedom from. Negative freedoms, if you will, are freedoms to. So, if we think of freedom as essentially I have a right to, not be persecuted by my government, I have a right not to be harassed or taken advantage of unfairly, mistreated by people, then essentially we're talking about forms of positive freedom, freedoms that protect us. But increasingly, what we've seen in Western democracies and in the United States as well as in Europe, particularly during the early 20th century in the United States today as well, is we see that often freedom isn't thought of in terms of these sort of freedoms from. That generally speaking, our lives are allowed to become more and more controlled, more and more taken advantage of by, in the case of our lives, things like multinational corporations. That to some degree being exploited is something that's allowed, thought of as okay, and in fact is a state of freedom. And we see this often with, we have that as a conception that would fall under negative freedom. So economic freedoms have a tendency to be negative freedoms. Essentially, I have the freedom to be at risk. I have the freedom to be in danger, and that other people have the freedom to exploit me for financial gain. And that the government should not intervene and cannot intervene in these things. So essentially, we have this instead a girth of negative freedoms and often a slow erosion of positive freedoms, meaning that we live more and more dangerous, uncertain lives as time goes on. What later theorists, particularly a figure by the name of Zygmunt Bauman, will call liquid modernity, right? That we have this sort of like this sort of system that rather than being rigid and controlled, it's uncertain. That we have uncertainty and risk in our lives more and more. So for Erich Fromm, this creates a certain situation that because we're experiencing these negative freedoms, often we escape from our freedom. We look for security over freedom. Which is why we have a tendency in later Western democracies to lean towards authoritarianism. Essentially, the idea of strong leaders, right, who are capable of protecting us, that we can lean on, that we can essentially give up any authority to, it doesn't matter, and they're going to take care of us, right, is in essence like a way of escaping from the insecurity that capitalism has constructed. So that's one way we see that. And we see this idea, the idea of giving up that freedom for him, for Fromm, he uses the term collective regression. And here we see the use of Freudian concepts, right? So we have collective regression. For Freud, regression is essentially this desire to go back to a state of childhood, right? To be protected and secure. That essentially, like, rather than sort of naturally developing into an independent adulthood, we instead transgress into this desire to regress into this desire to be taken care of. And so you see that, right? You see that within Fromm, this Freudian idea. Okay, so that's one example. Another example we get can be seen in the work of Herbert Marcuse. Particularly his work in One-Dimensional Man. Also, Eros and Civilization. So for Marcuse, and this is just one concept that he creates, one use of a Freudian concept reworked through Marxism, is this his idea of surplus repression. So within Freudianism, repression is essentially that we repress our innate desires, right, to be able to live in society. For Freud, this is often particularly sexual desires, but it's also the desire to be aggressive with other people, things like that. So these sort of bodily drives. So we have to find ways of repressing those bodily drives to live in society. But this can essentially go wrong for Freud. And in fact, Freud, who was actually more of a sociologist than I think people give him credit often, sees us as in a slow changing society towards increasing repression. At the time when Freud is writing, this is Victorian society. So this is a society that's particularly repressive when it comes to sexuality, but this is not the time of Marcuse's writing. Marcuse is mostly writing in the 60s and 70s, a time that we associate with sort of like, rampant sexual freedom, right? The sexual revolution. Yet for Marcuse, he wants to claim that that's not really the end-all be-all of repression. That we can actually take Freud's concept and move it into essentially us giving up, right, our desires in any way, shape, or form. If you think about our work lives, right, our work lives become more and more controlled under Marx, right? They become more and more alienated. All that discussion of alienation we had earlier, right? We're not connected to the process in which we make things. We also have, we work more hours. And then in our free time, right, increasingly for Marcuse, we do things that are also just ways of sort of generating a financial surplus. When we watch television, essentially we're just watching television to make money for advertisers or for streaming services. If you think about, like, if you've ever been gone on vacation, essentially the only thing to do for entertainment, right, and this is true in general, is to spend money, right? People no longer do the sort of things that they used to do, but increasingly our lives become, right, a pursuit of activities that make other people money. And so Marcuse wants to sort of marries this idea of surplus, right? That essentially we work to construct a surplus that people can make money out of. And the concept of repression is he sort of combines these in a certain ways to understand this phenomenon. So essentially we are being called on to be more and more repressed, right? That we repress in a surplus, and essentially that it's this form of repression that generates increasing capital. So our lives become this sort of like holding back, this constantly holding back, even though it seems like, right, we're constantly giving in to impulses. So that's another example. So we see here this sort of reworking through Freud, in particular, of Marxism. Frankfort School is largely responsible for a lot of things we focus on when we talk about Marxism today. So if you were to go back before the Frankfort School, the way in which we taught Marx earlier in the class would have never occurred. We would have instead been focused very specifically on, the revolution, the idea that there was going to be an international workers' revolution to overthrow existing forms of governance and replace them with something else, right? Something that is in Marx, but theoretically is no longer used as much. And that's mainly because of the Frankfort School. The Frankfort School focused very heavily on things like alienation. And was also very doubtful of those forms of revolution, because essentially what they did is they became themselves totalitarian. They became increasingly controlled and to some degree became married into these sort of worse aspects of capitalism, which is something that the Frankfurt School wants to draw out. Okay, so you have two readings that are Frankfurt School readings. The first one is The Dialectic of Enlightenment by Adorno and Horkheimer, and the other is Walter Benjamin's What is Epic Theater? And in both of these we see them correcting Marx in a very different way. So this is the correction of Marx to get it to understand totalitarianism, as well as to move away from the forms of revolutionary Marxism practiced by, members, figures like Trotsky or Lenin. And so instead, the correction that we're getting from the Frankfurt School and the readings that you have is essentially this move away from what before we were calling historical materialism. if you remember, historical materialism was the idea that everything in society followed the economy. So, if you remember the concept of base and superstructure, right? That culture was just taken as this sort of thing to uphold the economic system. For the Frankfort School, they want to correct this sort of like weakness when it comes to culture from Marxism. So instead they're very interested in the ways in which culture themselves become a form of capitalism or become something that reinforces specific ideas about capitalism. It's out of the Frankfort School that we get the idea of ideology, right? Ideology is that there's sort of like hidden messages embedded within television shows, within music, not something that somebody's put in there like, you know, like put in there as a sort of like purposeful, like we're going to control you. But there's these ways in which culture, particularly capitalist culture, is reinforced, right, through the ways in which we talk about the world on television or in music. And you see that, right? You'll see that in the readings that you're looking at. They're going to be looking at very specific ways, getting into the nitty-gritty of like, how is it that ways of acting and thinking that help to support capitalist structure are embedded, right, within ideology, embedded within the cultural things that we consume. So there is the link on the discussion board. I'm also going to put up tomorrow some formal instructions, some written instructions on how to do that discussion board, what I'm looking for, etc. How it's going to be attached to points, you know, things like that. So, otherwise, have a great week. I'll post another video on our next theory on next Monday. Thank you. Have a great day.